This is the Gold Baron, and I want this to be the best video on YouTube on how to buy a used motorcycle. So we'll jump right into it. If you're going to get a used motorcycle, the first thing you should do is make sure it has a clean title. And a lot of people will ask, hey, is it a clean title? And they'll say yes. I always, especially if you're traveling to go see it, just have them send you a picture of the front and back. And some of the critical things is the title in their name. Make sure the back in the buyers isn't signed or dated. If it's dated, that means you can be many months out of the dated time when it was sold. Or if there's another signature on the front or the back of the purchaser, that's no-go. You really can't transfer the title to your name and actually own the motorcycle. That's the first thing I check. If it doesn't have a clean title, there's not really much point in going to even see it. If you do buy the motorcycle, I always like to take a picture of their driver's license who's on the title, just in case anything happens. If you can, ride the exact same bike that you're going to look at before you go and look at a used one. That way you know how the bike should feel before you ride one that's used and that you've never seen before. That way you can know if it's like really low in power, something doesn't feel right. If you've never bought a motorcycle before or ridden many motorcycles and you're buying your first motorcycle, don't go ride it alone. Bring a friend that is very comfortable and rides a ton of motorcycles. It's always better to have them test ride it for you and then to let you know if you're not very comfortable on the bike. Or better yet, find someone that owns the bike you're trying to buy and is very familiar with it and have them ride it because they can tell you if it's really good or not. A couple things to bring with you whenever you look at a motorcycle is a voltmeter, a rear stand, which sometimes you don't always need, but for the R6 it's a little bit hard to check the oil if you don't have a rear stand. A flashlight, hex keys, very important, and bring some riding gear. Along with that, if you're planning on probably purchasing, get a bill of sale. You can just print one off for your state. Don't forget to bring gear whenever you're gonna ride the bike. Don't skimp out on that. Who knows what the condition is or how it's gonna treat you on the ride. You've never ridden it before. And also, any problems that you find with the bike, like fork seals or the chain needs to be replaced or fluids, make a list of that stuff. When you go to make an offer on the bike, tell them, hey, it needs a chain, it needs new tires, it needs this. Use that as, a point of interest for your purchase of the bike. Start with a cold bike. You don't want to have it warm. A lot of times when it's warm, it can have trouble starting or idling. Make sure the bike is cold when you first go and look at it. All right, jumping into the mechanical of the bike. I know this is an R6, but this applies to dirt bikes, cruisers, lots of different bikes. Check the tires. Tires are so bloody important on a motorcycle. Check the date of the tire. If you don't know how to do that, you can look it up online. It's pretty easy to. It'll have the date on the side of the tire. Check the dates. If they're 10 years old, you're gonna need new tires. Along with that, you can check the brand of the tire. I love Michelin. You can just tell if it's on a sport bike and they have high quality Michelin tires and they're within date and they have plenty of tread, that saves you $500 potentially, because tires on a motorcycle, especially like this, can get pretty expensive. Obviously, check the oil. That's huge. That's very important. And also just make sure that it has the right oil level and that it smells right and everything like that. So check the mileage. Obviously, just make sure it has the mileage that you think it has. Then also, depending on the bike, especially super sport bikes, they have 20, 30,000 miles. A lot of times, especially on the R6s, they need a valve adjustment. Check the horn, really simple thing, but so many times when these bikes are in wrecks, there's a ton of lights and electrical things that people just go through and botch. Make sure, that's another thing, is check the wiring and all the the lines that go to the different wires as you can throughout the bike. If they're cut, if they're crimped together and crappy, just avoid that stuff. Don't go down that road. Check the lights. One critical thing is make sure whenever you press both the rear brake and the front brake that the lights actually kick on for the brakes. That's an important one. Check the headlights, make sure the brights come on, make sure the signals work on both sides. Oh, this is really sticky. I'm gonna have to go through and clean out all of that and make sure that works. That's good. I'm gonna check the front and the rear. Okay, one really important thing, and I can't stress this enough. I've bought about 7 motorcycles in my life, both dirt bikes and street bikes. The more aftermarket you see on a bike, the more I try and stay away from it. Now, it really depends. If you have a really high quality Öhlins steering stabilizer on a Yamaha R6 that don't come with steering stabilizer, that's a huge benefit. If it has some crappy exhaust or crappy levers or crappy grips or crappy aftermarket headlights, the more aftermarket, the worse. Like, check the chain and or belt or drive lines, and I can tell the teeth on the sprockets aren't super worn. If you don't know how to check that, there's lots of videos how. Make sure it's well lubed and taken care of, not super rusted. All that means is the person took care of the bike. And if you bring a rear stand, you can pop up the rear tire and check the tension, make sure it doesn't have any tight spots, which is common on some of these bikes, especially when they have higher mileage. Check the inside of the gas tank, okay? Make sure there's no rust, make sure it looks clean, nothing weird. Another critical thing that a lot of people forget to do, the key that's for the bike, and it's positive if they have the OEM key, better yet, both of the OEM keys that come with the bike, make sure that key fits in both the ignition, starts the bike, make sure it opens the gas tank, and it also opens up the rear hatch. Now, why I say that is if it doesn't, a lot of times when people lose or swap out the keys, if you try and get a set for an ignition, a gas tank, and the thing back here, a lot of that stuff is either super back ordered or you just can't find it anywhere except used. Open the tail. What I loved about this gray one that I just recently purchased is that it came with the stock toolkit in the back here, which is pretty rare, but it's the OEM Yamaha. It's great to keep with the bike. I always like seeing that if it comes with the original toolkit. So make sure that rear hatch opens, make sure the electrical wiring back there doesn't look funky or crappy. Open the tail. Brake pads and brake fluid color. Now, it's pretty easy to check the brake pads on one of these bikes, but also check the quality and the color of the brake fluid. On here you can see both the front and the rear reservoir are pretty dark, which means, in my experience, brake fluid on motorcycles, especially sport bikes, after 2 or 3 years, it's really important to bleed the brakes and have high quality fluid because it feels a lot better. Whenever you do ride it, make sure there's no warped rotors. My Blue R6 has a little bit of a warped rotor on the front end, so every time I brake, it shudders a little bit, and that can be a pretty expensive fix. Really common one, fork seals. And this one on the left side has a fork seal that's leaking. I know how to do fork seals, I've got the equipment and everything, but that can be pretty expensive, $200 to $300 to get the fork seals replaced. A lot of times, every used bike after 5 to 10 years is going to have leaking fork seals, so in my mind, that's not something to shy away from. Just make sure the check engine light isn't on whenever you start the bike. Now, different brands have different methods where you check the code if it does have a check engine light. Just be familiar with the common things that can go wrong with these bikes and the codes. And also how to check the codes. Fairings and body, I mean, that's almost every sport bike you see is going to have a little scratch here. It's going to be down on one side, very common thing, but just, it's not a big deal for me to see a bike that's down, but just know that if you want something really pristine, fairings are expensive, and every time in my experience that you buy aftermarket fairings that are not OEM, they don't fit quite right, they fall off, the plastic melts, they're cheaper quality. OEM is best. If it's missing a bunch of bolts and pop pins, be careful when you ride it. You don't want the fairings falling off. If it's downed in multiple areas and it's got damage to the frame, probably shouldn't be getting the bike. But small one, but very important. Check the VIN number on the bike. A lot of times it's up here. On the R6, it's right under here. Check that VIN number with the VIN on the title. Charging system, another very important thing, especially on Suzuki. Check to make sure the battery has good voltage. Whenever you start the bike, it cranks up right away and it doesn't have any, it's not slow to start. If it's slow to start, a lot of times you'll need a new battery. If it cranks okay, just from that start alone, it's probably going to need a battery in the next year. And checking the voltage, especially on Suzuki's, is very important. I would say on Yamahas and Honda's in very good condition. Normally they don't have any electrical issues in my experience, but especially on Suzuki's, just check to make sure that it's charging appropriately when the bike is running. So what I would do before you run the bike, check the voltage on the battery. If it's 12.2 to 12.7, that's a pretty healthy voltage. Then turn on the bike, make sure it's charging between 13.7 to 14.5 volts. If it's charging above that, a lot of times that means that the rectifier is bad because it's not regulating the voltage from the stator correctly. If it's not charging at all, it can either be the rectifier or the stator that's not charging it appropriately. But if it's the bike is running and it's charging at 12 volts, something's wrong. Now, that's why I said to bring Allen keys. You gotta pop off 2 of them to get to the battery. That way you can actually check the voltage. That's why I always bring those tools with me to check that. Steering stabilizer. Now, this may not be relevant depending on the bike that you're getting, but some of these sport bikes do not come with steering stabilizers, and if you plan to track this or go any sort of higher speeds, death wobbles are real and they suck, and you really need a steering stabilizer. Think about a steering stabilizer because those can be very expensive. Check the exhaust. If it has a really high quality Akrapovic exhaust or full exhaust, that can be very expensive, and maybe you're looking for that. So make sure to check the exhaust. A lot of times if it has an aftermarket exhaust, it'll be missing parts, hangers, bolts, it'll be loose, it'll be falling off. Check the exhaust, that's an important one. Clutch, feel, and lever. And this one I gotta show you guys because it's very important. Whenever and before you ride the bike, make sure, put a little tension, make sure it has some free play. You don't want it to be tight, like I just said it. See how it's tight? There's no free play. That can often mean that they've been burning up the clutch and that it will need a new clutch. You always want a little bit of free play before you ride. So check the clutch, make sure it's got that free play, that's essential. Also, while you're riding, check the clutch. Don't stress the bike until it's nice and warm, but get in second or third gear when you know you have traction in a lower RPMs and peg it out. Make sure it's got a lot of load and torque on it, and make sure that clutch isn't slipping. Make sure your hands aren't on the clutch or it's tight like that. If it is, it could be slipping, but you may just have it adjusted wrong. While you're riding the bike, check the brakes, make sure they feel good, make sure the power's all there, make sure there's no funky noises. Obviously check for leaks, that's an important one. Fork seals, brakes, engine oil, all that stuff. When it's cold and after it's been running for a long time. What I like to do is I go for a ride, let it run, let it sit for another 5 minutes, just idling, getting nice and hot, and I check for leaks everywhere. Sometimes they can be really hard to find, and that's why I recommend bringing a flashlight, because sometimes they can be very difficult to find. Now, if you look here, this is the water pump on the R6. It's hard to see, but there's some coolant leakage down there. And it's in such a tiny spot, it's super difficult to spot, but unless you're looking very closely, that can be an indication of the water pump leaking. So if you can, check the coolant level, that's another important one. Whenever you ride the bike, people have different opinions on this. What I like to do is bring the cash that they're wanting, or at least something close to that. Generally, always bring someone with you if you're handing off the money while you ride. Have the money in hand. That way you can say, if you wreck it, you buy it, which is just an ethical thing that I've always done whenever I'm buying and selling a bike. Once you're done riding it, I would also recommend shutting off the bike, letting it sit for a little bit, and starting it a couple more times. On the 06, 07 R6s, they have a lot of valve train issues, and an indication of that is when they're cold and you rev the bike, it'll shut off. Or when it's cold, you run it for a minute or two and it's not fully warm, you shut off the bike, try and turn it back on again, and it stutters when trying to start. So start it and stop it a couple times, if you can, when it's cold and when it's hot, just to make sure everything's running good. Mirrors, man, like I said, the more stock things on bikes, the better. On both Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki's, when they have stock OEM mirrors, it's the best. As soon as you put on aftermarket crap, there's so many things you don't think of. Like whenever you're having to go through some tight traffic, these fold great, they're sturdy, they don't rattle or jiggle around, the visibility on them is pretty good, they fold out of the way easily, they're secure, they're high quality. You get anything aftermarket and they're junk. This is self-explanatory. See if they have a maintenance record. I've never known someone with a motorcycle to do that. That's just me. But if they have that, it's almost guaranteed that they really care about their car or motorcycle. So a little bit about me. I've put almost 70,000 miles on street bikes and close to 100 miles on dirt bikes. I have my Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering. I do most of my maintenance on motorcycles myself. So anything from tire changes, oil changes, transmission work, really everything on the bike, I pretty much do myself. Quick look, this is what I'm thinking when I go through this. I think, man, that exhaust, I'm gonna have to replace that. I'm gonna replace this. I'm gonna put on a steering stabilizer. I noticed that this bike is lowered, so I'm gonna have to change out the rear link under here to the OEM to be able to fit a steering stabilizer. I noticed that it doesn't have any weird aftermarket headlights. I already tested the headlights on this thing. Looking at the tires, seeing the quality of those. Check out the brake pads. If you notice right here, it's missing a fender, so I'll probably have to buy and purchase that. Oh, look, fork seal is leaking and the shaft seems pretty scraped up, so that might be an expenditure. The horn is there. It looks like a lot of the stuff is stock. It's missing a pop pin there, missing a pop pin there. It's got tape right there. Looking at that, looks like it's an OEM exhaust. This is loose. It's interesting. Looking for coolant leaks right here. It's got the stock radiator fans. Oh, it's got inverse shifting on it. That's good. Looks like it has a stock chain. I can't really check the front sprocket, but I can the rear. No major damage on this side. Seems like it's idling good. No valve train noise. It sounds very healthy. Everything looks stock from here. I already checked the oil on this bike.